So today I'm going to be talking about, as Simona said, visualizing enterprise data with Angular and D3. Visualizing data is something I'm really passionate about. Most of my experience has been working for large financial institutions or insurance companies, that sort of thing, where we have huge amounts of data, and often we're asked to show the data in raw format because, regulatory requirements, people need to be sure that what they're seeing is what they're actually going to be based decisions on. And that's great, and we need to do that. But often showing the raw information in tabular format or just in spreadsheets is important, but you lack the insights that a visual representation can sometimes give you. So I encourage people that do this sort of thing, do what the users ask you to do, but I'll be willing to offer and suggest visual representations of the data that you might not be asked for in the first place. So data is king. At the end of the day, you've got to show the data that is underlying the business decisions, and that's important. But large data is hard to understand, and in the world we're in, increasingly, where we've got large data, big data, millions, if not trillions of rows of data, it's really hard for even people that are familiar with the data to interpret or get meaningful insights from the data. As humans, we're very visual animals. We're able to digest a huge amount of information from a picture. My favorite example are road signs. In simple road signs, everyone can understand that, if you've got roundabouts, maybe not in the US, roundabouts is the first second, you've got a turn coming up on the right, and that's amazing. It's a huge amount of information just on a small piece of information. I'm not sure what the last one is. I think it's a playground. I don't know, maybe people are escaping, but either way, you get a huge amount of information from just a snapshot. Now, if you can do that same thing with large information and make business critical decisions, that's awesome. So, in light of the recent Winter Olympics we've got, the example we're going to be looking at is Olympic data information from 2000 to 2012, I think, and see if we can get some insights or information from there that's maybe not as easy to get from just the raw information underneath. So let's go to this. So this is the information above earlier. So it's got all the information we have here. We can sort this information by number of total medals won, which is already what's here. And you can see Michael Phelps is leading the pack there with 8 medals. But we could do much more, even just in a tabular format. So let's say we wanted to group it by country. Okay, so the United States is up front by quite a way, and then Russia and Australia, number 3 there. And that's great. That's already given me more information than we had earlier. Let's take it a bit further. Let's say we want to break it down by athletes. So that's fine. If we look at it, United States there, Michael Phelps is up top there with 3. So that's great, but it's not telling us a huge amount. All the information's there, but we're not able to get much in the way of insights. Let's try group by medals. Well, that's great. We can see that the US has leading the pack, as we saw earlier, with 1,300. Next up is Russia. So that's interesting, and that's more than we had in raw tabular format. But we can take that even further if we represent the same tabular information in a visual representation. Let's take a look at what we can do there. So the visualization, what do I mean when I say visualization? Well, visualization is just the mechanism by which you translate raw, quantitative information into a graphical representation. Often, that's a chart that you'll already know, bar charts, pie charts, that sort of thing. But it can be anything. And D3, which is what I'm going to use here, is really powerful at really out-of-the-box, left-of-field thinking. It's got some great images, great visualizations you can use there. Graphs, which is we will cover now, but also maps, directed graphs, all sorts of things. I won't go into all that. Go to D3, take a look. But it's hugely powerful, hugely flexible, and just really can bring your information to light. So at the end of the presentation, I encourage you to go check out D3. But as I said earlier, what visualization is really going to help us do is get insights into the data, find insights into in the noise that you might see. So we've taken a look at the application. So at the application that I'm going to demonstrate here is a fairly simple, standard Angular application We've got an app component. It's going to have a grid component on the left, and then a chart component on the right. The chart component we're going to demonstrate here will be a bar chart, stacked bar chart, or a pie chart. So it's fairly simple. We've got a service in between the grid and the chart to translate the information or convey the information to the chart in question. That's not terribly interesting, so we'll go into the next part and actually look at the application. So there's the information we saw earlier, but now I'm going to add visualizations to the mix, see if we can get some more information that's not as readily available. So already we can see, forgive the colors, these are just the natural colors that come out. So as we saw earlier, we can see that the US is leading the way by almost double the next up, which is Russia, and then it scales off. So already what I like about this, although this is really simple information, really simple, and you could get this information from the tabular data, which we've already seen. What I like about this is that even at a distance, just at a glance, you can see the US by far in terms of medal winners. Now you can get that from the aggregated data we saw earlier, but you have to read, you have to scan left to right, you have to scan down, and you'll get that information, but in one glance, you see all that information and more. You can see that there's a pattern, there's the US way up, and then it kind of scales off. That's amazing, I think. Now imagine you take that further into a business critical decision where you've got money on the line, you've got to work out where are you going to invest, where's potential, where are you losing money, where should you stop investing. That information will be there, but if you can derive it from a snapshot and then go back to the raw data, which you have to do to ensure what you've said is correct, that's amazing in one glance. So let's see if we can take this further. So it's the same information, but now we've broken it down by gold, silver, and bronze. And what I really like about this is that although it's the same information, we're getting even more insights. So here we can see, let's just look at the US and Russia, roughly the same bronze. The US has almost double the amount of silver and almost triple the amount of gold. In one glance, you get 3 or 4 pieces of information that you would have been able to get in tabular data, but it would have taken you far longer to derive. In one glance, we've got a huge amount of information at our disposal. I think that's awesome. And if you can get this from a simple example of Olympic data, can you imagine what more you could do with business critical information? And we'll look at one last thing. So I'm looking at the top 10 athletes with athletics, who's won the most medals in the top 10. And again, I mean, this won't be a huge surprise, the US and Russia comes first, and then everyone else trails first. But what's interesting about this, again, in just one sport, again, US and Russia are dominating. You get so much insight, and no matter how you cut the data, you can get more insights at a glance, and then you can go back and look at the raw information and say, well, actually, how many medals did the US win? How many did Ethiopia win in the scheme of things? So visualization really just brings so much more insight and information to your raw data. So that's the end of the application demo. Take a look at D3, which is what I'm using here, to how you can use D3. When I first started looking at D3, I found it a bit daunting. So the documentation on the D3 is brilliant, but it's not where I would go if you're trying to learn D3. So what I'm going to cover in the rest of the talk is just some pitfalls and certain things that aren't immediately obvious and that are crucial and core to how D3 does things. So D3 is a great library. It's not an Angular library, but you can make it work really well with Angular. The project, which I'll put up on GitHub afterwards, shows how you can use them in directives and that sort of thing. You still need to do some stitching together, but it really works nicely. So an example which I'm going to look at now, which is outside of Angular, just demonstrates how you can use D3. So we've got a simple div here with row, and we've got 4 circles, which I'll show you in a minute. Underneath, we've got some data with numbers. We've got 5 sets of numbers. So that's we'll come back to that. So we've got 4 circles there. We've got 5 sets of numbers. So what D3 is going to do here is select all circles, and then the dot data method is going to associate the data in turn from left to right in terms of the array to those circles. So when I run this, each circle is going to have the corresponding data value associated to it. So the first circle with an ID of first will have a value of 2 associated, the second one 4, and so on. But as I say, we'll come back to this in the second or third slide. We've got 5 items in the 5 values in numbers, but only 4 circles. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So let's take a look at that. So that's fairly clear. We've got 4 circles. If I run that, so just to demonstrate that we are associating data, if I look up the first circle, which I gave an ID of first, and I look at it, right at the bottom, D3's added the underscore data with a value of 2. So it is actually already modifying the DOM items with your data, and it'll use that later on when you chain further calls. So we don't need that anymore. So like jQuery, D3 does a lot of chaining. You don't have to chain calls, but it's idiomatic when you're using D3 to chain things, to select things, to add the data, to then do things with the data you've selected. So in this example, we're going to take our circles, and we're going to scale the height, width, and radius corresponding according to the data we have. So if it's a small value, it's going to be a small circle. If it's a large value, it's going to be a big circle. So what we do with the first 3 styles is set the height, width, and border radius according to the value. The radius is obviously halved because it's a radius. The last item to draw out, and this is one of those pitfalls that people can often hit with D3, is that the D3 will draw from the top down. So left is 0, 0 is top left, and when it draws something, and you draw, say, 10 pixels, it'll draw from the top down. Normally, you want like a bar chart to be at the floating down to the bottom of the axis and draw up. So what we're doing with the bottom style is set a margin and offset it, which we'll show you in a second what that means. So if we take a look at that. And run that. So now we've taken that data and associated it. So we've already scaled out the circles. And what I meant by the large step was, if I hadn't have changed the margin top, you would still have the circles. They would still be in order like you have here, but all the circles would be floating on the top. So by setting the margin top and taking away the height of the circle, it's having them aligned to the bottom. Sometimes that doesn't matter, but with a lot of graphs, it does matter, especially bar charts and that sort of thing, where your user expects the data to go up, not to go down. So that's the first pitfall, or first thing that can trick people, I suppose. The second thing that people find a bit confusing is enter. You'll often see in a D3 thing, it'll select something, even if you don't have any of those. So you might say select all circles, and you think, well, I don't have any circles, why am I selecting circles? It's just the way D3 does things. It's got 2 sorts of selection buckets. The first is to select existing objects, and the second is enter selection. And if you've got more data items than you have selected, they'll go into the enter selection. So in our example, we had 4 already existing circles, and we associated 4 values, but we actually had 5 values in the array. So that 5th value, if we call enter, we'll say, okay, I've got more data to come. Anything that's going to follow that, do this with it. So the first 4 are existing elements, and when you do a select, it'll fall into that select and be associated with data. Anything else will fall into the enter selection. And I'll show you an example of that. So we'll comment this out. Oops. Live coding. Sorry? Yeah, exactly. So now these 5 circles. I'll show you the code there, just so it's clear. So the top part is what we already showed you. It's doing a selection, it's modifying it, scaling it out. And then the second selection is saying enter. And what that's telling D3 is that Okay, you've already processed the selection for existing items. Now for any extra items in the data array, and remember we had 5 items in the array, 4 items, anything that is not associated to an existing DOM element, do this with it. So what we're going to do here is create a div. We're going to associate the circle class to it, and then as we did before, set the height, width, border radius, and margin top according to the value of that item. And that will be a result in what you saw earlier. I've broken this up for legibility just to illustrate the point, but if you look at the D3 examples, often you'll see something like that. And that makes sense, hopefully now that I've explained it, but if you come to examples and you see a whole stream of chain, it's often hard to see the wood for the trees or work out what it's doing. But just remember, you'll often see in the D3 examples a select, and that's really for existing items, then an enter, that's for new items, and something I'm not going to cover now, but there's also an exit, and that's for items that are no longer in your array. So for example, if I've got 4 circles, if my data only had 3 circles, in the exit I could then remove items. So enter is for new or additional items, exit for items you want to remove. I'm not covering that now, but it's still worth knowing that it exists. One other note, although I haven't used it here, if you look at the D3 documentation, you'll often see G, append G, and do things with G. G is just a group. Think of it as a div or a template, and often it'll be assigned a value of G, so it's not clear what that means. When you see G, append G, or do something with G, it's just a group, a logical grouping of DOM elements. All right. So that's that. So the last thing I wanted to touch on this talk was scales. So in this, the code that I've had so far, it works fine because the values I chose were deliberately able to fit on the screen, and I just timed the value by pixels knowing that they would fit on my screen. But what happens if your values are millions or hundreds of millions? You obviously can't fit that onto a screen. And what happens if you want to show horizontal values all across the board, but you've got many? How do you scale them so they fit nicely? That's where scales come in. There are many types of scales, but I'm going to cover the 3 that you're likely to use in your application. So the first one is ordinal scales. As it says there, it maps discrete values in an array to discrete values in an array. And the ranges will repeat if you've got more values. So in this example, we're saying we want to have an ordinal scale. We want to have the domain of my data. So a domain is the values in your data. So when you see domain and range, domain is your business values, your actual data you're after, and the range is what typically will be rendered or shown on the screen. So in this case, we're saying the domain is the data, arg, b, and x, and the range I want to use are red, green, and blue. So if we call that, in turn, you'll see RGB, red, green, and blue. It'll pick it out in order. And if I do a fourth value there, it'll scroll back to red. So it loops around. You'll often use ordinal scale and band, which I'll follow next, on your horizontal axis. So you might have dates, January, February, March. You might have days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, things that you can generally partition. Band scales are similar to ordinal, but they use a continuous range. And it'll split the range into a value of range. It'll scale it. So the first one is fixed buckets. The second one is fixed buckets, but scales it. So this is useful when you're doing bar charts, for example, and you want to scale the width of the bands. So you want to scale them horizontally, when you'll use a linear scale for that. We'll come back to that. But you also want to scale them horizontally, but within a constrained bands. So as before, we've said RGB, but the range this time is 0 to 200. And you might do this if your width of your graph or your image is 200 pixels wide, but you've got 3 values, and you want to know how wide they should be. If you say R, we'll give you 0, G was 66, B is 133, and you can see what it's done is scale it divided by 3. So you'll use that when you want to do things horizontally, sometimes vertically, but typically horizontally. And the last one I want to show you are linear scales. You'll use this a lot. You'll typically use this for your y-axis. So you'll use band and ordinal for your x-axis, for your known values, or the values that are more fixed in domain values. and then you'll use a linear scale for your horizontal. This is similar to the band, but it's typically used more on wider open ranges. So for example, you've got a domain of 0 to 10. Those are your business values, 0, 1, 2, 3 to 10. And if the scale is 1,000 pixels high, 0 with 0, 2.5, it's scaled to 250, 7 scaled to 700. So you can see that if I had that bar chart that I showed earlier, which is actually what I am using in the real example, my values are much bigger than the pixel display, and I scale it according to a linear scale. So that's what the scales are doing for you. Band and ordinal for fixed, known horizontal scales, and linear for varying, but greater than you're likely to display scales. Those are the main things I wanted to cover and can cover really in half an hour. I encourage you to check out D3. I'll ping out the GitHub repo with the code that I've got for this. It really works nicely when I've used this with Angular. You have a fairly thin directive or a fairly thin component that wraps a lot of this, and you'll be able to use your bar charts and your pie charts and any sort of chart in an Angular component. They work really nicely together. D3 is really quick. It's a little bit jarring when you go from an Angular to a D3, but I actually found using TypeScript and Angular really useful in D3, where you're able to type the parameters you get instead of just having loose types, and you know what you get and the command completion that you get from that. So it's a little earlier, that's fine. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to be at the Meet the Heroes session afterwards. If anyone has any further questions, please feel free, or now. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.